Okay. It's after 10, and we're going to go ahead and get started. We got a lot to cover today. It's hard to interrupt this trial and restart it. So my goal is to see if we can't get through the whole thing. But this is a big chunk, so I'm hoping that we can get this under control. We did get started into it a bit last week. And as you're making your way to your seats, we'll just kind of review a little bit from what we covered last week. We kind of gave an overview of Jesus' trial, or I should say trials. In truth, there were two phases to the trial. There was a Jewish phase, first of all. The Jewish trial was caused and came about because of Jesus' real enemies, which were the religious leaders there in and around Jerusalem. And the focus of that trial, or actually that series of trials, the focus of that was his religious offenses. And specifically, they were after him because they thought he was committing blasphemy over and over and over again. And then we moved from there into the next phase of the trial, which will be the Roman phase of the trial. The reason this trial had to take place was because the Jews were seeking a capital sentence. They were seeking the death penalty, and that was the only way that could be accomplished. And so they have to shift their focus a bit in order to make that appeal to Rome, and in order to shift their focus, they present this as being a threat to Rome, and that's kind of where we are headed over the next couple of weeks. Now, last week we also took a look, the Jewish phase of the trial, which was part one. The Jewish phase of the trial actually divides into three parts itself. The first part is this hearing before Annas, who was the previous high priest, and that's recorded only in the Gospel of John. But then if you look in the Synoptic Gospels, you'll see that there's a first trial before Caiaphas, where Caiaphas is the current high priest, and he meets with part of the Sanhedrin. John says nothing about that trial. And then as the night progressed and they're getting into the early morning hours, virtually all of the Sanhedrin appears to have come together by this time. And the Jewish trial concludes with Caiaphas continuing to press the issue with them. Again, this is completely omitted by John, but we can read about it in the Synoptics. So John's description of the Jewish trial is really limited to this preliminary hearing, which goes on between Annas and Jesus. And we'll see why that's important as we move into it. So in Jesus' Jewish trial, the Jewish phase of his trial, there are three important groups or individuals that we need to know about here. First of all is the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, of course, was the Jewish ruling council led by the high priest. It was officiated by the high priest at the time. And their sort of things they could prosecute and their ability to level sentences and things like that for their criminals was limited by Rome and restricted primarily to religious offenses by Rome. And because Rome didn't want the Jews' own trial group being responsible for all of the law keeping in the nation. So the Sanhedrin was the first group that's important here. Secondly, we're going to meet this fellow named Annas. We talked about him last week, and we called him essentially the godfather of Judean politics and religion at the time. And he and his family ran Judean politics and religion for many years, decades, and they enjoyed a great amount of wealth. First of all, they enjoyed a great amount of power, and they enjoyed a great amount of reputation amongst the people. And so that is the man Annas that we're going to meet as we get into the trial further. Caiaphas, who we really don't read much about in John's version of the gospel, Caiaphas was the current high priest at the time that this is all taking place. And what John continues to emphasize about Caiaphas is that he is the guy that originated the idea that it was better that one man die for the nation than the whole nation perish, okay? And that was back a few chapters in John, we saw that brought out. But as we go through this again, John mentions it again. He wants us to think of Caiaphas in those terms. So I think that brings us up to where we had arrived. We got through in chapter 18, verses 12 through 14, when this cast of characters has sort of started to come together, and Jesus has been brought in front of Annas for this questioning period. But then there's kind of a diversion that occurs, and that occurs in verses 15 through 18 of chapter 18. And this is where we sort of take a snapshot at what's happening out in the courtyard. And this, of course, is going to bring us face to face with Peter. So this is what we read then in John 18, starting in verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. And because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" the girl at the door asked Peter, and he replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they'd made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Now what this is, first of all, is a validation of what we read back in verse 4. And what we read back in verse 4 was Jesus was about to be arrested. John inserted the comment that Jesus knew everything that was going to happen. And of course, he had predicted that this would occur earlier in the evening, as the evening got started, and he was talking with Peter, and Peter claimed his allegiance was better than anybody else's, and that he would last no matter what. Jesus said, "You're not even going to make the night." and now it's beginning, all right? And this is the first stage of that. But also this passage again introduces this other disciple that we've read about a handful of other times, and we're starting to see that this in all likelihood had to be John himself, okay? This other disciple, we learn, was known to the high priest, okay? And he was also known to the household servants. He talked to the girl at the door and had some influence so he could get Peter in. Yes?
I have to wonder, do they know that he's a disciple?
They have to know that John's a disciple, and there's a reason we can see that. We'll get there in a minute.
So why did she ask Peter
And have a problem? Why did Peter have a problem and John didn't?
Yeah, you're right.
Well, we'll get there. Now, when we read here that it says this disciple was known to the high priest, that term for known is not just a casual acquaintance. They knew each other well. They were well acquainted with each other. This is a deeper than just a knowing who somebody is or knowing them by name. He was around, he knew them, and certainly he shows that he's been around the household also, because he gets access to the courtyard and he's able to get Peter in too. So there's a theory that has arisen partly because of this and because of some other things we're going to see. There's a theory that John or John's mother may well have owned property or a house in the city of Jerusalem. And maybe that's part of the reason that they were on speaking terms and knew one another. Now, what I want, and this kind of is moving towards Craig's question there, I want you to think about, we always look at this incident, it's one of those things kind of like Doubting Thomas. We look at this incident, we see Peter's failure. But let me ask you this, where are the other 9 apostles? They're somewhere else. They've gotten lost along the way. John is known to be a disciple, and nonetheless he walks into the high priest's house. And then Peter, because he's associated with John, also has to be identified as a potential disciple. So I want for us to think about this as to the courage it took for John and Peter to be in this location. And now especially for Peter, because what has he just done? He's just lopped off the guy's ear. Remember? Back in the garden. So there's a lot going on here. In verse 17, the NIV leaves something out that I think the King James and the ASV capture because they're more literal translations. But the NIV leaves out the idea, and it's there in the original text, where it should read something more like, surely you are not another disciple, are you? Okay, so as they ask Peter, they are clearly identifying John as a disciple. Are you like him? You're coming in with him. And so they have made that connection between the two of them, at least the girl at the door has. You're not one of them also, are you? So she has lumped them both together. And clearly John's cover is blown at this point. John has been revealed for who he is. But why then does Peter react so defensively? Well, there's 2 or 3 ideas here. Number one, when the girl asks the question, she puts him on the defensive. The way she asks it, she says, you're not with him, are you? You know, it's not, well, who are you? Where are you coming from? Why are you here? It's, you're with him? So she's questioning it already from the beginning. Secondly, Peter is not familiar with this place. John has been there. He knows these people. He knows what he's doing. Not so much for Peter. Peter's out of his element. He's not in a place that he's familiar with. And so it's easy to understand that he might be more defensive about this than was John. And then the third thing we've just mentioned is he had just committed an act of violence. And it turns out that there's a relative of the guy there too, and we're going to see that later on. Okay? So I think there are 2 important comments that we need to see here as we put this in the context of everything else that we're looking at. Number one, this certainly sounds like an eyewitness account because he describes it's cold, it's dark, you know, people coming, people going. This sounds like an eyewitness account as you read through it. But secondly, it's cold. And amongst all the other things that we think of Jesus undergoing at this point in time, think about the fact that it's cold. And all the torture, the emotional torture, the physical torture. And, you know, when it's cold, you just want to go huddle up and bundle up and be warm. That's an overriding thing. These guys are standing by a fire because they need it to keep warm. And that's just another thing to put on the list that Jesus had to endure here for us. Well, that brings us then to the questioning by the former high priest Annas. And we're going to see that in verses 19 through 24. There are some things that we need to understand about Jewish trial law before we get into this. First of all, legitimate trials began with witnesses, not with questioning. Okay? In fact, there is some thinking that it may have been illegal to question a witness under Jewish law without talking to witnesses and having witnesses present the story. That's sort of what in our judicial system is you can't incriminate yourself. You can't force somebody to incriminate themselves. But here, in this questioning scenario, they're sort of just presuming that Jesus is guilty and asking him to defend himself. So they're making a presumption of guilt and forcing him to defend himself. And they're also forcing him to speak for himself rather than bringing witnesses to establish the charges against him. In reality, the facts are not in question. Jesus isn't going to deny any of the facts about what he has taught. He's not going to do that at all. But what we're seeing already as we look at the beginning of this questioning period is John is exposing this thing as a farce. That's what's going on here. He's pointing out that this is not the way the Jewish system was supposed to work. But, flip side of that, watch for Jesus, because he stays in complete control of the situation. So, now let's read 19 through 24. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I've spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. He's appealing for witnesses to be brought. okay? You need witnesses in order to convict me. And when Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest, he demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? And then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas, the high priest. Annas goes after 2 lines of questioning with Jesus, according to verse 19. First of all, he questions him about his disciples. What sorts of questions do you think there might have been? Well, how many of you are there? Who are they? How likely are we to have a problem with them once you're gone? That's really what they're getting at here. Is there a likelihood that we're going to have trouble continuing because of them? And so Annas is trying to determine the level of risk that they presented and whether they need to take any further action. And to that line of questioning, Jesus really doesn't respond. There's no answer here that answers that issue. And so once again, that's just like Jesus, what he did when he was being arrested. He sheltered, he protected his disciples. And once again, he doesn't expose any of them to anything here. But the second part of the line of questioning was, okay, well, what are you teaching, Jesus? Well, Jesus now answers. And he says, you should know. And undoubtedly, Annas did know. That's what Jesus is really pointing at. This was not something that was hidden. This was not something that was quiet. This was something that Jesus had taught day after day after day in the temple courts and the synagogues throughout Palestine. And it could not have been unknown to Annas. So undoubtedly what Annas is seeking here are those incriminating details. What can I get from him that I can use in the formal trial that's coming ahead? And Jesus' answer is neither defensive nor apologetic to Annas. And he even carries an air of supremacy here over the guy who's acting as his judge, or at least his questioner. And Jesus now states unequivocally that he has no hidden agenda. Everything he has done has been transparent from the beginning, and he is what he says he is. That's where Jesus is at in this thing. Well, he is struck in the face for that. It was probably illegal in Jewish courts to strike someone in the face before being sentenced. Okay? Not so in the Roman trial, but in the Jewish phase of the trial, it was probably illegal. Jesus is just asking for fairness, and he's pointing out that this whole thing is not being done fairly. Provide some testimony, he says. Testify. Okay? And so he's exposing his opponents for what they're doing, which is wanting him killed, and how they're doing it, which is any which way they can. Okay? In verse 24, then, Annas sends Jesus on to Caiaphas. Of course, Caiaphas is the presiding officer of the Sanhedrin, so that is where this thing's going to have to go next. He's going to have to get a verdict from the Sanhedrin eventually. And John records no details of that further trial. Now, there's one thing that we need to address, and that's if you're looking at, I think King James is the only version that does this. In verse 24, most of the translations put this in the present tense. Annas sent him to Caiaphas. The King James puts it, Annas had sent him, had already sent him to Caiaphas. Okay? There's really not very good evidence for that. The evidence is overwhelmingly in favor that this is. It's not that Annas had already sent Jesus to Caiaphas, but that he sends Jesus to Caiaphas after the questioning of Annas. Okay? Because it just gets into a difference in the way you read the text. If you read it in the way that the King James presents it, then you go back and starting in verse 19, you have to shift all this to being Caiaphas's questioning, okay, instead of Annas's questioning. That's probably not the way it was really written. Jerry?
I'm just wondering, were they expecting some trouble because they said Annas sent him bound?
they seem to be paranoid about trouble, and no wonder, because Jesus is a very popular figure. They know that they are skirting on the in the dark edges of what's legal and what's not here. They know that there's a risk in this situation. So I think the short answer to your question is absolutely yes.
Well, just within the last week, they were welcoming Jesus and throwing
Right.
things on the ground. He comes in on a donkey, where
Right.
Rome is doing the, same thing as the other side.
If you read carefully through the Synoptic Gospels, John doesn't include it, but if you read carefully through the Synoptics, once Jesus enters the city on Palm Sunday, the week before, once Jesus enters the city, that week, he is speaking parables and messages of judgment to the people. He is forcing decisions on the parts of these guys. That he's bringing this thing to a head. Once again, you see Jesus in total control of the situation. He is driving the verdict. He is driving the whole process. And you'll see it if you put that whole context together. Okay. I think we covered this. The court, when we look at this section pertaining to Annas. Go ahead.
I thought, no, they bound him. They arrested him in the garden. It's obvious they're treating him like he's somebody that has done something bad.
That's right.
And I think that just kind of underscores it. As he moves from person to person, he's bound. It's saying we have good reason for what we're doing here.
Well, and they're probably saying that to themselves, but they're probably also saying it to those who are looking on.
Right.
They need to justify, there's a propaganda war going on here too. They've got to win the people. And so if they treat him like a criminal, maybe they'll identify him like a criminal. Okay? Yeah. Good point. Thank you. Okay. Now, before we leave this section, I just want to go through and review with you some things that are violated here. These are some Jewish legal requirements that are violated in this process. Number one, the trial location. This was not, this trial that we read about with Annas was not conducted in the halls of justice. This was conducted in the high priest's house, in his palace. Okay, that was not the location for this type of a thing to happen. Secondly, in Jewish law, legal proceedings were not supposed to start at night. Why? Because that's a simple way to organize a kangaroo court and push something through, right? But this clearly started at night. No legal proceedings were supposed to begin on a Sabbath or a high feast day or the days before those things. Okay? They didn't want their religious observances to be interrupted by legal things. So they were not supposed to have happened here. Well, this is not only the day of Passover getting started, but tomorrow's Sabbath. Tomorrow's Saturday. So there's many offenses here. Convictions and sentences depended solely on witness testimony, they could not force questioning upon the convicted one. In the Synoptic Gospels, we don't read about this in John, but when Caiaphas convenes the actual trial itself, the Sanhedrin called witnesses, but what happened? They couldn't agree with each other. They weren't credible. There wasn't a credible witness in the bunch. And who finally presented the evidence before the Sanhedrin?
Oh, one of their own.
What's that?
One of their own. I don't know.
No.
No?
You guys should know this. Jesus himself. Jesus himself presented the evidence because they asked him the question, "Are you the Christ?" He said, "Yes, it is as you say. But I say to all of you, in the future, you'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." And when he said that, that was the blasphemy they needed. Okay, what's that?
He lit the fuse.
He lit the fuse. He's the one that signed his own conviction. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to do that. That's why I think we should know that. That's part of what he gave up for us. The slap in the face for Jesus was likely illegal. We've talked about that. Conviction and sentencing were supposed to occur on different days because a trial and the conviction leads to often a sense of great emotion. And one should not be sentenced, they won't be sentenced fairly if they're sentenced right on the heels of that great emotion of a conviction. And so conviction and sentencing were supposed to be spaced out, but they're not going to be. Now, why are they taking all of these illegal measures? Well, there's a time pressure that's building. They've got a certain window of opportunity here. They've chosen to do this during a high feast time, and there's a risk in that because Jerusalem is crowded. Jesus enjoys tremendous popular support. But on the other hand, the existing religious hierarchy has no greater moment of power. During the feast days, that's when they are at their best. Their pageantry, their show is more than the exposure that they will get at any other time during the year. So this is their opportunity. It's a window of time that's going to close for them. Lamar?
And God picked the perfect stage for all this.
Boy, did he. Boy, did he. And not only that, the Roman officials, like Pilate, who they're going to have to get to sign off on this thing, he only works from dawn till noon. That's his work day. Okay, that was typical for the Judean officials put in place by Rome. In addition, they know that there's a time clock ticking because they have to get that body off the cross. Tomorrow is Sabbath, and that body is not only going to have to be dead, but it's going to have to be off the cross by tomorrow morning. So we've got a time pressure cooking here, and we've got to get this thing done, and they're feeling this tremendous sense of urgency to get this thing pushed through. So they're in a tough place. The bottom line about this phase of Jesus' trial is, number one, it wasn't a trial at all. It was really a criminal investigation to see how they would be able to present their case to Rome to get the verdict that they wanted. That's what this whole thing is about. Well, then John takes us out to the courtyard again. Whoops. Yeah, that's right. Meanwhile, we're down at the bottom of this list now. We already looked through the rest of it. But we're down at the bottom of this. In verses 25 through 27, we go back out to the courtyard and we see Peter again. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it, saying, "I am not." And one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" And again Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. John is the only one that brings in the identity of this third accuser, him being a relative of the man whose ear was cut off. Once again, that gives us great credibility that he must have been an eyewitness. He must have seen both events to link this guy together and realize, just as this guy is identifying Peter, John is identifying him as being the guy that was in the garden. According to the synoptics, we can see that as we go through Peter's denials, the agitation is escalating in Peter. And it's the synoptics tell us that he even began to curse in his denial. Okay, as he's working his way through this, he's feeling the noose tightening around his own neck. And John doesn't tell us that specifically, but what he does say is their witnesses become more focused. And finally, this third witness is a guy, you don't put that away. He got him. He was there. He saw him. This guy had Peter dead to rights, okay? He saw him. He would not have been mistaken in his accusation. That's the guy that cut my cousin's ear off, right there. You don't miss that, okay? And that's John's way of pointing out the acceleration of this situation at all. And then, again, what John doesn't record, he records that the rooster began to crow, but he doesn't give us Peter's reaction. And the synoptics tell us what? Peter went outside. He met Jesus' eyes. He went outside, and it says not just that he wept, but he wept bitterly. Oh my.
Is there also, by the rooster crowing, giving us a timing that now
Sure.
it's morning?
Yeah, it's getting closer to morning for sure. Yep. Okay. Undoubtedly, Peter is regretting what he has just done and how he's let Jesus down. But I think there's something else going on too that causes him to weep, and that is that Peter's realizing once again everything Jesus said is coming true. And what else had Jesus told him about the time that he told him he would deny him? He told him he was leaving. Peter, you can't come where I'm going. And that's why Peter made his statement that I will never leave you. Peter had to be thinking about that too, that just like my denial here and my actions were seen by Jesus, he really is going to leave us. This is a bad situation we're in here. This is unfair what's going on to him. He's going to be gone in no time. And that had to be hitting Peter as well. Wow, what a double whammy. Jerry?
Just a question. I was wondering too, maybe because he was one of the followers of Jesus, Peter was, that they might put him on trial later.
Well, sure, that had to be their concern. That's why all these guys have run away. When we pick up the story after the resurrection, we pick them up that evening meeting together, but how are they meeting? With the doors locked. And then they're meeting together a week later, and the doors are still locked. Okay? They're concerned about their safety. Absolutely, yes. Okay. Now, there's one other thing. This is a bit of an aside, but I want to show you, I want you to think about a couple of contrasts here that show up in this final point of Peter's denial. The first contrast is compare Peter to Jesus. Jesus has stood up to his accusers and he denies absolutely nothing. On the other hand, Peter is cowering before his accusers and he denies everything. Okay? Then on the other hand, now, John doesn't point this out so much, but if you read the other synoptics, there's another comparison I think that we have to make, and that is to think about Peter in contrast to Judas. Both of them did things that they deeply regretted. Peter's guilt led to tremendous sadness and sorrow. But what it did in Peter was it caused him to be contrite and change and want to be different. He didn't give up. Judas, on the other hand, was filled with guilt. He too was saddened, but he thought there's no way to get out of this. There is no escape, and he went and killed himself. Why the difference in those two guys? Well, it boils down to the reason John wrote this book. It's all about faith. It's Peter's faith in Jesus being who he said he was that allowed him to go ahead and continue to serve Jesus in a full way, in a tremendously humble way from that day going forward. In Judas's case, however, his conviction led only to overwhelming guilt. He didn't believe Jesus was who he said he was, and so there's no place to go. There's no way back from this, and I just might as well end my life. Wow, what a difference, eh? Okay, well, we're going to get into the Roman trial. That's good. That's probably farther than I thought we would get. The Roman trial takes over now. We've sort of finished with what the Jews were doing with Jesus, and now we're going to see what the Jews do to the Romans and how they put Pilate in an impossible situation. This trial also consists of three parts, just like the Jewish trial did. The first part is Pilate's first examination, and then Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. And this seems to be more of just a curiosity thing on the part of King Herod, who wanted to see what Jesus was all about. He had wanted to meet Jesus. John tells us nothing about this. He tells us nothing about Jesus going before Herod. And then Jesus comes back and appears before Pilate again when the final sentence is finally pronounced. John's record is unique once again here, as it always is. The decision of the Sanhedrin, what they've decided to take to Pilate, is assumed by John. It's never really stated here. It's not, the verdict of the Sanhedrin is not really mentioned. There's no mention of Herod's involvement, okay, as we said before. And the reason for that is it's peripheral. It's not bringing us to any greater truth regarding who Jesus is. But what John does provide us is we get a lot more detail about this Roman phase of the trial. The synoptics primarily just tell us that Jesus stood there like a lamb before his shearers, was silent. And that's primarily what the synoptics tell us. Not so in John. We see dialogue between Jesus and Pilate. And then once again, as we've seen especially since the point of his arrest, Jesus remains in control of the situation, and he's really driving this thing. The key character in this part of the text is Pontius Pilate. Pilate was the governor of Judea between about 26 and 37 AD. He was appointed by the Roman Emperor Tiberius. He lived not in Jerusalem, but in the coastal city of Caesarea. And Caesarea, of course, the name comes from, it was built for the Romans to be their port city so that they could contact the motherland. And Caesarea's name is derived from Caesar. So that's the connection. When Pilate would be in Jerusalem, there were two places he would typically stay. If he was by himself, he would usually stay at the fortress. There was a fortress just north of the temple grounds on the edge of the city, which was called Fortress Antonia. And then if he had family members with him or something like that, they didn't want to stay in the barracks, then he would stay in Herod's palace. And of course, Herod's palace is one of the tremendous structures of the first century. It's known as being an architectural accomplishment. It was inlaid with gold. It was just a beautiful, beautiful place. So during this feast, he'd apparently come to Jerusalem with his wife, because we read about some of those interactions in the synoptics too. And so he must have come there to monitor the activities and keep his pulse on what's going on here in the city. Be sure things that are staying under control. And the Hall of Judgment was located, the Roman Hall of Judgment was located at Herod's palace, and it was known as the Praetorium. So you'll read about the Praetorium in certain accounts of this, and that's the location where these things take place. Now, there are some things to observe about Jesus' Roman trial. First of all, watch how the Jews drive everything that happens here, okay? They are twisting Pilate like a puppet, okay? And just watch as we go through that. Pilate makes several attempts to steer things away from Jesus' execution, but they will not be deterred. They smell blood in the water. They're after him. To these same Jews, the real crime Jesus has committed, once again, is blasphemy. But they won't be able to get Jesus executed for a religious reason, so they have to sell something else. And what they land on is treason. They're gonna try to convict Jesus before Rome of treason. And they will portray Jesus as being a king who is rival to Caesar. And that's the angle they're going to take here. Many people have accused John of shifting the blame and shifting it from Rome to the Jews, because Rome was so powerful, and at the time John wrote this, it may have been dangerous to have named Rome. So therefore, he's put this all in the hands of the Jews and their manipulation of the situation. But the reality is, neither the Jews nor Rome come out smelling like roses in this, okay? The Jews, as you read through John, they appear to be just crazed with hatred for him. There's only one thing they want. They won't consider any alternative. They're focused on getting this guy killed. That's what it's all about. Pilate, on the other hand, the agent of Rome, comes across as timid, weak. He fails to stand up for what he believes, which is Jesus' innocence. And the overriding thing in Pilate's mind is preserving himself and his own position. And that's the way these two things come across. So I don't think it's fair to say that John was shifting blame. He was just laying it out there for everybody. There's plenty of blame to go around.
Well, Pilate was in a position that he couldn't afford to go against the wishes of the Jews because of his problem with Caesar. But Caesar had told him, if I hear one more thing about these Jews complaining about you, you're out.
That's right.
So God, once again, picks the perfect scenario where everybody's locked in their position and they can't move.
That's right.
Now, there's one thing that jumped out at me in verse 28. It
Yep.
said the Jews wanted to hurry up, and it said, by now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Now just think about the Passover and the spiritual significance after all they've been doing up to this point.
That's right.
It's almost like arguing with your brother and saying something nasty about it and then you'll take communion. You know, it doesn't fit.
It just doesn't match, does it? Yeah.
Is
Yep.
God not naming himself as the author because as he's writing this, he's being persecuted and
There's been 2 or 3 thoughts in terms of why John doesn't name himself. One is perhaps it was that dangerous at the end of the first century. I don't know. I don't see John being that timid myself. I think it's more that he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. And he doesn't want this to be read that way, that this is about John. He wants to be sure that its focus is where it needs to be. I think it's got more about his desire to remain relatively anonymous in this thing. Honestly. Okay, so now there's a couple of other things I want you to see about this Roman phase of the trial before we get into it. Number one, the outcome seems inevitable. As you get into this thing, this path is going like that, but we're going to end up in those doors down there. I don't know how we're going to get there, but the outcome of this thing is inevitable. It's predetermined. But there's another thing, and this is almost a little bit theatrical, but I think it's also symbolic. There's what happens in this phase of the trial, because of what Lamar just alluded to, the action goes back and forth. When Pilate needs to talk to the Jews, because they won't come in his palace, he goes outside to talk to the Jews. That's stage 1. But then when he talks to Jesus, he has to come back inside. He comes back inside, and he's at stage 2. All right? And then he goes back outside. And then he goes back inside. And so his action, in a symbolic way, he's stuck in the middle, just like he is politically, like he is religiously in this thing. And it's borne out by the fact that he can't even conduct the trial without getting torn in half. He's got to be 2 places at once, and he can't. You know, and that's the position he finds himself in. So that's kind of just an interesting take. I'm going to try to get through one more section here today. I know we're running long, but like I said, we have a time pressure on this too. So I want to, we're going to take a look and try to get through verses 28 through 32 as Jesus is handed over to Pilate. Okay, so here we go, starting in verse 28. The Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor, and by now it was early morning. And to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the judges objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Verse 28, this is what Lamar was bringing out a minute ago. The Jews are worried about ceremonial uncleanness. And indeed, entering the palace of a pagan would make them unclean. And then as a result of that, they would not have time left to complete the ritual cleansings that they would have to go through in order to eat the Passover meal. And it's been discussed. We're not going to go into a great deal detail as to exactly which meal is being referred here. Just let it be known that in order to continue and participate fully in the Passover activities, they would not have been able to because they didn't have time to go through the cleansing rituals. And so Pilate goes outside the palace to meet them. Why would he go out to them? Well, it tells us that he's quite concerned. We were talking about the danger of this situation a few minutes ago. He's going to go outside the palace to meet these guys because he knows this is a powder keg. This is something that could easily blow up. And so he's very concerned about their activities, and he doesn't want anything to get stirred up. In all likelihood, the soldiers had already, the Jewish leaders had already come to him sometime earlier, maybe a day or two earlier, because they had requested Roman soldiers to be involved in the arrest. And so he had to have some idea what the game was. As Sherlock Holmes would say, the game was afoot. And he had to know it. But this is where Lamar was going a minute ago. Don't miss the irony of this moment. Here the Jews are, and they are elaborately avoiding ceremonial uncleanness so that they can eat Passover. Whereas, at the same moment, they are intentionally manipulating the judicial system in order to kill the Passover Lamb of God.
Amen.
You get that? On one hand, you've got them avoiding ceremonial uncleanness because they want to eat Passover. They want to have the show right. But on the other hand, they're perverting every ounce of justice in order to get the outcome that they want, which is to murder someone. Okay? That's what we're dealing with in this situation. In verse 29, Pilate, who has now gone outside, asked the Jews, what are the charges you're bringing against Jesus? And it almost seems like the Jews didn't expect that question because they don't have an answer for him. Perhaps they thought he would just rubber stamp their plan because he'd already allowed his troops to be used in the arrest or something. Maybe he would just rubber stamp it. And instead, Pilate begins a full legal hearing. Maybe he was already concerned about what his wife had dreamt. Maybe that's the reason that he feels, I can't just go along with this. There's some problems here that aren't passing muster. Okay? In verse 30, the Jews seem a little surprised at that question. What charges are you bringing? Well, you're going to ask us that? And they don't really answer, and instead they say, just trust us. Just trust us.
He must be a criminal because we said he was.
Yeah, we wouldn't do this if we didn't have evidence, good evidence for this. Okay? But in verse 31, Pilate doesn't bite. And if they're not going to participate in the legal process, neither will he. You take him and judge him yourselves. You take care of this thing. This is an internal squabble. Rome has no place. We don't have a dog in this fight. This is up to you Jews to resolve. It's an internal matter. But verse 31, the last part of it, tells the real reason and the key for their questions and their actions and everything they've done. The key thing is when they say, we have no right to execute anyone. That is the only thing they want out of this. However they can get it. That is their goal. And then in verse 32, we see that John includes the note that Jesus had indicated already in his ministry the type of death he was going to die, because he had talked about being lifted up. The first time we see that's back in chapter 3, verse 14, where the text in Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, it said, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man will be lifted up. In chapter 8, verse 28, Jesus said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am the one that I claim to be. And then in chapter 12, verses 32 and 33, he said, when I'm lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto myself. And of course, this idea, this phrase of being lifted up was foreshadowing his ultimate crucifixion, which was a death by being lifted up. Okay, we need to beg off here. We will pick up next week at chapter 18, verse 33. And at that point, Pilate is going to go back inside now after he's talked with the Jews. Now he's going to go back inside and question Jesus. Okay, God is good.